Cool.
So let me mention, so long as I've turned on the recording, a few of the housekeeping rules I was going to bring up a little bit later. Um, First, we are going to be providing copies of our slides to everybody who attends. Um, so don't worry about taking notes. Relax, try to take in the material. You will have the slides. The slides are go into stuff that I'm probably not going to have a chance to get to. Um, this is a public Zoom. So we're going to have people here. Anybody who comes and is signed up is welcome, so long as they remain respectful and they don't try to interrupt us.
I know.
Um, we ask that you don't try using the Zoom AI note-taking feature. It has a weird tendency to throw spurious comments into the chat. Um, as you notice, we're recording the session, so if you don't want your face or your name to be part of the recorded record, go ahead and turn off your camera and you can change your name. Um, we're going to be putting pertinent information from time to time, peppering it into the chat. They will be full of good resources that you can use. So keep an eye on that. We will take questions at the end, but we're going to ask you to hold those questions. If you like, if you've got a question that you just have got to ask, type it into the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat and we will raise all those questions. Please keep your microphone muted, um, and in your comments, be respectful. And with that, I'm going to return to our regularly scheduled program, which was in
Mhm.
progress before I forgot to do the recording. Um, so maybe since I forgot to do the recording, I'll just quickly look at the slides I've already presented, and these are the headlines that I showed you earlier about how your voting rights are under attack. And we mentioned the SAVE Act, requiring documentary proof of citizenship, which tens of millions of Americans do not have, and do not have easy access to. Also mentioned the plethora of state laws that have been adopted recently, roughly 100 of them counted by the Brennan Center in the last year, um, restricting voting on a state level. So when we say voting rights are under attack, there's a lot of evidence for this. And here we are. This is where we came in. Um, as Professor Campbell says here, um, the struggle to preserve, to expand voting rights is likely to be one of the defining struggles in our politics for our generation. Um, so in this kind of a setting, um, we felt that a usual, normal, know your rights presentation that explains how you vote, um, the best ways to do it, simply wasn't going to be sufficient. What we need is for our activist core to truly understand voting rights, where they come from, how they're won, how they're lost, the interplay between US law and state law in terms of where our voting rights come from, um, some information about California, because every state's rules are different. A bit about voter registration, because the right to register to vote is obviously key to the right to vote itself. Some specialized voter rights. And then what's critical this year is understanding your right to vote free from intimidation. Well, we're not going to cover today, unfortunately, is always a lot of stuff. Um, if you're not convinced that your voting rights are under attack, we are not going to spend a lot of time trying to convince you that this is a problem. And if you're not convinced, that's fine too. It's always valuable to know your voting rights and where they came from. There are a lot of specific threats to elections we're just not going to be able to get to, like gerrymandering. We're not going to get into Citizens United or finance stuff. Um, I hope you're happy with what we do cover. It's not possible to cover all of this in the time we have. So with this, let's start. Where do our voting rights come from? And what we've got pictured here is, and maybe I'm showing my age, but these were the photographs that might show up in my civics textbook, assuming I had a civics textbook, about how our voting rights were granted to us, um, by white men dressed up nicely, signing pieces of paper, surrounded by other white men. And the bottom right corner, the other way it's presented is with a timeline where our history gradually moves from fewer rights to greater rights in some kind of inevitable process of enlightenment. And I'm going to strongly tell you and strongly suggest that this simply is not the way it works. Our voting rights were won in struggle. We fought for these rights. People bled and died for these rights. And predominantly, the people who fought and bled and suffered, so we have the rights that we have today, are Black Americans, Indigenous Americans, and other people of color. They have led the way. And so many of our rights are a process of a struggle that was won for us by those folks. Um, so I want you to note in the picture at the bottom left, we have a group of largely Asian American children. Um, the Asian voting rights, that's a program in itself. It wasn't until the year 1898 when the Supreme Court finally acknowledged that birthright citizenship under the 14th Amendment applied to Asian Americans. It wasn't until the 1940s and 1950s that Asian American immigrants were given any kind of a path to citizenship. And it really was not until the adoption of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that these rights were secured in any way. So the Voting Rights Act did not just provide rights for Black Americans, it provided rights for all Americans. The bottom right, we see Native Americans voting. Um, the sad fact is that many of our states continue to disenfranchise Native Americans even after the end of the Civil War and the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments. Um, it was not until 1924 that the United States passed the Indian Citizenship Act, which granted citizenship to all Native Americans, but even that did not guarantee voting rights. Um, again, this has been a struggle, and it's a struggle for many, many different people and peoples. And we stand on the shoulders of giants today when we talk about where these rights came from and how we're going to protect them. So another point that is critical to understand is that voting rights are not merely won, they're also lost. Um, so this is a picture of a group of the first African American senators and representatives elected after the Civil War. Um, there were an estimated 25 seats in Congress, won shortly um, after the onset of Reconstruction. All those folks lost their seats when Reconstruction ended and Jim Crow began. In an eerie parallel, after the Supreme Court began the evisceration of, well, now that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is almost completely gone, we're looking at the loss of something like 19 seats in Congress, one-third of the Congressional Black Caucus, as a result of what the Supreme Court has done and the subsequent gerrymandering that took place in southern and western states. This is not the only example of where rights have been lost over time. Women's suffrage. Women had the right to vote in New Jersey until 1807. Before the Civil War, there were several northern states, including New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, that granted voting rights to free Black men and then stripped them away. Um, we are we're dealing here with what is a continual struggle. There are doubtless things about what's going on in our country today that are new. Um, but voting rights is something we have always have to fight for. Um, so in that to that extent, what we're seeing is part of a continuous struggle. With that, let's get into a discussion of what our rights are. And I'm going to start with a quiz. Um, Now, I can't see very many of you on screen because I'm sharing screen. So I'm just going to have to trust that you're doing this. The question is in your quiz is, what provision of the U.S. Constitution guarantees your right to vote? If you don't know, most of us don't know, and I didn't know until I began putting this presentation together. I just want you to raise your hand. Um, if you don't know the answer to this question, you can be brave about this. You can go ahead and raise your hand. I'm going to assume that everybody who was going to raise their hand has done so. And guess what? If you raised your hand, you got an A. It was a trick question. The U.S. Constitution never explicitly guarantees a right to vote for all citizens. Um, if that comes as a surprise to you, it came as a surprise to me. And I went to law school. Um, Thought it would have been there somewhere. Um, as you can see on the screen, Supreme Court cases like the one in Reynolds v. Sims found an implied right to vote in the Constitution. But as we've seen from our Supreme Court, implied rights can slip away pretty easily. Um, in fact, the first time the Constitution ever mentions the phrase right to vote was with the adoption of the 14th Amendment in 1868. What the Constitution does do is it indicates various areas where voting rights cannot be taken away. You cannot deny or abridge voting rights based on race, color, sex, failure to pay a tax, or age, so long as you're over 18. But again, understand the fact that you cannot take away a right for any of these reasons does not mean that the right is going to be conferred to people who have these characteristics. It's a difference. Um, and unfortunately, that difference has played out over the years in people being denied rights, notwithstanding what constitutional amendments say. So, whoops, what did I just do there? Oh, ha ha ha. Are you still seeing my screen? Yes, okay. Um, I clicked a live link on one of my slides. So the original Constitution does address voting rights in an important way, albeit indirectly. Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1, the times, places, and manner clause. And since this is written in language that I don't think is that easy to understand, let's summarize what it says. Under the Constitution, the primary right to regulate voting, both the way it happens and who is eligible to vote, is granted to the states. Congress is given the explicit right in the Constitution to step in to regulate the time, place, and manner of elections. So there's a bit of a bifurcation there. The way it's understood is that Congress can come in and address how elections are conducted, but they're not supposed to come in and address who is eligible to vote. And as a quick aside here, the Constitution provides no independent authority whatsoever to the president to regulate elections. The fact that we will run into authority the president may have to say what the post office might do or what the National Guard might do and that sort of thing. Let's just understand, at least as a matter of law, the president has no direct authority over elections whatsoever. So let's talk about a concrete example of how the federal government and the states split this duty of determining what our voting rights are like. And we'll do this with the example of women's right to vote. And I will use the example of Utah. Utah was one of the first places in the United States to grant women the right to vote before Utah ever became a state in 1870. With Utah as a territory, Congress stepped in 1887 and stripped women in Utah of the right to vote. How could Congress do that? Utah wasn't a state yet, so Utah didn't have the rights granted to states to regulate elections. In the meantime, other states, Wyoming, Colorado, California, granted women the right to vote before the adoption of the 19th Amendment. And that's a right to vote not just in state elections, but federal elections. And when Utah got its right, got its statehood, it immediately gave women the right to vote back. Um, when, as a result of struggle, um, women's organizations and others fought for women to be granted the right to vote. When that struggle won, in order for women to be granted the right to vote on a nationwide basis, it required an amendment to the Constitution. The thinking being Congress alone, with its Article 1 powers, did not have the right to tell the states who could vote and who can't. So it required a constitutional amendment, as did the right for 18-year-olds to vote and then the right of formerly enslaved people to vote. It's all done by constitutional amendment. So there is a power sharing here between the feds and the states. States have the primary power. The federal government can step in with time, place, and manner regulations. The determination of who has the right to vote, in theory, belongs entirely to the states. With that, we've talked about the Constitution. There are two other areas of federal law we need to address. One are laws adopted by Congress, statutes. We talked about how Article 1, Section 4 gives Congress the right to regulate time, place, and manner. Up until 1965, Congress did very little of this. There were some laws that were passed during Reconstruction, anti-Ku Klux Klan laws. But for the most part, Congress stayed out of this. The first major voting rights bill by Congress was the Voting Rights Act, adopted 61 years ago today. I would love to tell you we picked the date to do this presentation because we wanted to get it on the 61st anniversary. I'm just not that good. But we realized it today. We've included it in. Happy birthday, Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act was adopted because, notwithstanding the adoption of the 15th Amendment, following the end of Reconstruction and the advent of Jim Crow, the rights of Black people to vote in the former Confederate states really did not exist. In 1910, the Black voter registration rate in a number of southern states was below 2% of the Black population. The impact the Voting Rights Act had on this situation really can't be understated. By 1966, just 1 year after the adoption of the Voting Rights Act, the percentage of Black voters registered in Alabama went from 11% to 51%. In Tennessee, from 27% to nearly 72%. It's again an indication that rights that exist on paper don't necessarily exist in reality. It took the adoption of the Voting Rights Act and an aggressive U.S. Department of Justice to make these results happen. The Voting Rights Act, again, was born in blood and tears and struggle and, in many cases, in death. With the Supreme Court decision in Shelby v. Holder in 2013, which struck down one of the two principal prongs of the Voting Rights Act, we have already seen a decline in the progress that was made in 1965. We've seen a small but significant drop in Black voter registration in the former Confederate states. We also saw shortly after Shelby was adopted, more than 1,600 voting places were closed by southern states, again, largely in predominantly Black areas of their states. I will probably say this more than once. Voting rights don't exist merely because they exist on paper. They are won through struggle and they can be lost. The photo, by the way, at the top right is showing state troopers in a state trooper riot breaking up a civil rights voting march in Selma, Alabama, shortly before the adoption of the Voting Rights Act.
And to add to that, the man in the coat there, is John Lewis.
Ah, very good. Thank you. Um, so we're not going to talk that much about the Voting Rights Act because there's not that much of it left. But we are going to talk about two extremely important federal voting rights laws um, that you do need to know about in order to understand where we are on this. Number one is the so-called motor voter law, adopted in 1993. Motor voters sets up a minimum national baseline for voter registration that the states must follow. Obviously, the way that, like the name says, you can register to vote at your DMV. But probably more significant, motor voter established a national voter registration form that all states must use when registering voters, at least for federal elections. They have to make it available. Um, this form requires voter registrants to sign under penalty of perjury that they're citizens, um, and also requires states to offer voter registration to people who are homeless. Um, and they must accept voter registration applications at least at least up to 30 days prior to election. And you'll see that California has adopted this and has made these rights stronger. When we talk about the documentation of proof of citizenship, the importance of motor voter will become apparent. The second major law on the books is the Help America Vote Act, adopted in 2002. This sets up forth a minimum national standard for voter ID. So never let it be said that the federal government does not have a voter ID provision. It it is a voter ID, these are voter ID requirements for people to register to vote. Um, this also mandates states to offer provisional ballots and a free system for you to track your vote by mail. Provisional ballots, as you will see and later in the presentation, are really a surprisingly critical piece of what makes up your right to vote. So we've talked about the Constitution, we've talked about federal statutes. The third big area of federal law are Supreme Court decisions. And as much as I would love to, play lawyer with you and talk for hours about Supreme Court decisions, I'm not going to do it. It's a very complicated area. I'm going to simplify it. Other than a 25-year period between 1945 and 1970, the Supreme Court has almost always acted to restrict voting rights. From the Dred Scott decision in the 1850s that declared that no Black person could ever be a citizen of the United States, which required the 14th Amendment to overrule, um, to decisions following Reconstruction in the Jim Crow era that justified and authorized a host of different Jim Crow practices, to more recent cases that allowed states to deny the right to vote to convicted felons, even after their sentences have been completed. Um, the Supreme Court has almost always acted to restrict voting rights. So while our current Supreme Court, I guess you could say they fit disturbingly well into this tradition. Um, and maybe if I'm given another hour, we can talk more about Supreme Court decisions. But um, going to move on from here. I want to talk about a few key areas of federal voting rights that are really kind of the hot button issues at the moment. Um, and this goes into the SAVE Act and things you've heard about the SAVE Act. To understand the conversations that we are having, it's very important to distinguish between what we mean by voter ID versus documentary proof of citizenship, because the two things are getting confused. You hear a lot of people defending the SAVE Act by saying, what's wrong with requiring a voter ID when the SAVE Act is primarily documentary proof of citizenship. So voter ID is simply a requirement for a voter to identify who they are. either when they register to vote or when they vote. It's a self-identity type sort of thing. Documentary proof of citizenship is a requirement that the voter prove that they're a citizen. The second thing is a lot harder to do than the first thing. Um, you need to keep those two things in mind because there is an interplay between them, but they are very different kinds of requirements. Now, we talk about voting and citizenship because today there's definitely a connection. That connection has not always existed. Um, the US Constitution never says that you have to be a citizen in order to vote. And in fact, many states for a long time allowed some non-citizens to vote. By 1926, all of the states had adopted state rules requiring that you had to be a US citizen in order to vote. But there was no federal requirement on this until fairly recently, 1996. Maybe I'm showing my age thinking that 1996 is fairly recent. I don't know. I'll do the best that I can. Um, but while citizenship and voting don't always go hand in hand, citizenship has been used as a means to keep people from voting. We mentioned Dred Scott, which was definitely a way to keep Black Americans from voting. Um, the early U.S. laws essentially limited citizenship to white men with property. Well, it's definitely more voting, but it's still this idea that of course you have to be a citizen in order to vote. That may be true today. It's not necessarily historically true. Um, when it comes to voting and having to prove citizenship, we're talking about something far more recent. Um, for most of US history, even the states that required citizenship in order to vote did not have specific requirements to prove it. The first state to adopt a documentary proof of citizen statute was Arizona in 2004. Um, the law was struck down 9 years later by the Supreme Court in one of its rare pro-voting rights decisions. And again, that decision was based on motor voter. Remember back when the motor voter requires states to offer the right to register to vote in federal elections, where people would sign an attestation under penalty of perjury that they're citizens. Supreme Court said because that's the requirement under federal law and because of Article 1, states cannot require more than that to prove citizenship to vote in a federal election. In response, a number of states bifurcated their system and have separate voter registration for state elections and federal elections, which can be a disaster. But about 12 states have that now. Of course, if the SAVE Act passes, these rules all change. But again, the idea of proof of citizenship is a relatively recent thing. So circling back to voter ID laws are a very different thing. Um, all states have some form of voter ID requirement because you need it in order to register to vote. Generally, you're providing driver's license number or something like that. 36 states require a form of proof of ID in order to vote. 23 of those 36 require photo voter ID. Important to note, California law does not require voters to show ID when voting. I put that in bold because it's important for us to remember when we're poll watching and election observing, it's common for trolls to show up at the polls and say, if you don't have your ID with you, go home, you can't vote. Um, in red, there is a very narrow exception in California. If you register to vote online and if you don't provide your driver's license or the last four of your social, you're going to need that one time to bring some form of ID to the polls. And if you fall into that narrow category, you will be informed by mail. Um, Last thing to mention, under federal law, your right to vote free from intimidation. There are a large number of federal laws that address this. The ones I'm showing here are only criminal provisions, including the provision that expressly states that armed federal agents are expressly prohibited at voting places. Um, Meaning that if somebody sends an armed ICE agent to a polling place, they are breaking federal law. Now, who's going to enforce that? That's a whole other question. Right now, I'm just saying the right is here. Um, what does prohibited voter intimidation look like? We're going to be getting you training on this, particularly if you end up doing poll watching, because it becomes very important. And our friend Daniel Gonzalez at Unidos 805 has provided me with training on this. Um, Understand it simply that it's more of an actual or threatened violence. Um, we're talking about, people showing threats and say, hey, if you vote, I'm going to have you arrested. Um, if you disseminate personal voter information, if you go knocking on doors, spreading baseless information, all of this can be voter intimidation. Um, and obviously, a big part of the work that we need to be doing this year and in upcoming elections is further education on what voter intimidation is and how we prevent it. So here's a quick summary. Your voting rights under federal law. And you're going to see these rights are not nearly as broad as what we get under state law, but you kind of expect that from the way I've set up Article 1. The right to vote under the Constitution is implied with specific prohibitions against denying that right on certain bases. You have certain rights with respect to registering to vote. You have a right to vote without submitting proof of citizenship, at least in federal elections. The right to vote by provisional ballot and to track that ballot, to vote free from intimidation. These are all critical and central rights. I'm showing you here a slide from the ACLU, which summarizes what I just said even more briefly. Elections are primarily the creatures of the states. The president does not have constitutional authority to change anything. And most significantly, despite all of the noise out of Washington, D.C., federal voting laws have not changed since Trump was elected at the end of 2024. Um, with that, I'm going to take a deep breath and we move to state law. So here are the primary provisions in the California Constitution. And I don't know, maybe it's my eyes, but I just say, oh, this is much better. California provides an affirmative right to vote if you're a U.S. citizen, a California resident, and you're at least 18. You not only have a right to vote, you have a right to make certain your vote is cast. And while that may sound like a funny distinction, I think I'm happy that I have both of those rights. My rights can be denied. I'll only if I'm judged mentally incompetent or if I am currently serving a felony conviction in a state or federal prison. And rights lost because of a felony conviction are automatically restored after completion of the prison sentence. We're going to talk more about that because it's not quite as automatic as it sounds. But I want you to notice after each one of these rights, I've listed a voter ballot proposition where the most recent version of those rights was established by the voters of California. Again, our rights aren't granted to us. We go out and we win them. So in addition to the rights that we have under the California Constitution, there is something called a Voter Bill of Rights, adopted in 2002 on a straight party line vote. And the Voter Bill of Rights includes the rights I'm showing here, which are all derived from the Constitution as to who gets to vote. And then we go on. You have a right to vote if you're a registered voter, even if you don't go to the right polling place. You've got a right to vote if you show up at the polling place and you're in line when the doors close. You have a right to cast a secret ballot, which strangely enough didn't come up in any of our examination of federal law. There might be somewhere in federal law, um, but originally going back to 1789, the ballot wasn't secret. And you've got the right to get help to cast your ballot from anybody you choose, so long as it's not your employer or your union rep. These are important rights. Um, right to drop off your ballot at any polling place. We'll talk about this more. The right to get election materials in languages other than English. Um, and the right to report illegal activities. These are all part of your California Bill of Rights. Now, this is my favorite right. Um, you have the right to demand a recount in any election in California. And as far as I can see, you don't even have to have voted in that election. As far as I can see, you can demand a right to recount the mayor's race in Sacramento. Um, so long as you're willing to pay for the recount, you have the right to a recount. And interestingly, California does not provide for an automatic recount in any case, including if a vote ends in a tie. Um, I I'm I find this amusing. Part of your rights to vote in California, if you're a registered voter, you are going to receive a ballot in the mail. You have the right to cast that ballot in a number of different ways. Um, you can mail it back. I don't know whether you should this year. We'll talk about that in future programs. But you've got the right to drop it off at the elections office, at any polling place, at any ballot drop box location. And you also have the right to vote in person. So California gives you options. We've talked about how voter registration is a critical voting right. So California goes further than what's required by federal law, allows you to register to vote up to 15 days prior to election day. If you miss that deadline, there are still ways to register to vote. Um, and we will end up dealing and addressing those ways when we get closer to that 15-day deadline. They will often involve casting a provisional ballot. Remember, I talked about how provisional ballots are important rights. Um, this is a good chance for me to remind you, if you have moved or changed your name since you did your voter registration, remember to re-register to vote at your new address using your new name. That is how you inform the state that you want to amend your voter registration. So that's a little public service announcement. Let's get into some of the more specialized cases. Motor voter guarantees your right to vote even if you do not have a conventional address, even if you are homeless or houseless or living in your car or in any kind of non-conventional residential situation. You'll need some form of ID. Um, does not have to be a photo ID. You have to be able to indicate where you live. Does not have to be a fixed address. Could be a park bench. You have to have a mailing address, which if the homeless shelter where you live allows it, might be the address of the homeless shelter. There's also a right if you are in transition between former and future housing. You have a right to use your last known address, even if it's not clear to you that you're going to ever return to that address. Um, so in theory, your right to vote should not, you should have a right to vote no matter how it is that you're living. You also have a right to vote if you have a confidential address. For example, if you've been the victim of spousal or other abuse and you've gotten some kind of a protective order hiding your address. The program is called the California Safe at Home Program. And we have a phone number here, and there are people who can help you with this if you are in that situation. We talked about the right to vote if you've had a prior criminal conviction. One of the really sad things about the our voting rights situation in the United States is that more than 5 million Americans are denied the right to vote because of a felony conviction. Some of those folks are people who have served their felony convictions. Um, California, as a result of a ballot proposition, says that you will lose your right to vote while you are serving a felony conviction in federal or state prison. Once you're released, your right to vote is automatically restored, but you will need to re-register to vote at that point, the same as if you've changed your address. So it's not quite automatic, but you don't need, any kind of a permission. You don't need to do anything other than a voter registration form. Rights of voters with disabilities. This is without a doubt a presentation in and of itself. We've highlighted some of the rights that exist in California, including the right to get ASL large print, audio versions of materials, the right to vote in an accessible voting place, the right to either ask for assistance to vote or bring your own assistance, including your own ASL interpreter. The right that I'd never heard about, but some of my friends had, called curbside voting. You can call the elections office and arrange a time to drive by the elections office or on election day by a polling place and ask somebody to come out and get the ballot from you while you remain in your car. This is a very complicated area. If you are have a disability that is preventing or interfering with your ability to vote, call the county elections office. Even if the accommodation has not been written into the law, I am assured that they're going to figure out some kind of a way um, to make certain that you can vote. We've also listed here the phone number for the Disability Rights California Voting Hotline. It's a complicated area, but there are significant rights here. Not saying we have all the ones that we need, not saying we don't need to work harder. Rights of voters with difficulty reading English. This is one area where the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is still effective because it requires states to offer voting materials in multiple languages. In Santa Barbara County, there are 5 languages other than English where you can receive voting materials. That's Spanish, Chinese, Korean, Tagalog, and Vietnamese. Um, Not all languages are offered at all polling places, but you have the right to vote at a polling place um, that is using the language of your choice. California has its own law on voter intimidation. It's stronger than federal law. Um, so presenting false information about voter eligibility is intimidation. Questioning a voter based on their race or gender identity is intimidation. Significantly, I've been talking for a long time. Um, New California law, SB 73, now prohibits a peace officer from interfering in any manner with the administration of a California election. Why do we have this? Because a sheriff in Riverside County went and seized ballots in a ploy to try to get him elected to higher office. That is now expressly against the law. Who's going to tell the sheriff that the sheriff can't do this and get in the way and say, halt, stop in the name of the law? On that one, I don't know. But we do have the law. It's a step forward. Let's start to sum the whole thing up. What are your voter rights? Well, I guess one answer is, well, I just spent the last 40 minutes trying to tell you what all your voter rights are, but in one slide, you have an extensive set of rights on paper. The right to vote without the need to provide ID, a proof of citizenship in California. You have the right to register. You have the right to accommodations and assistance. And you have the right to vote free of intimidation. But as we've learned, rights on paper are rights on paper. The rights that we have, the rights that we've won, the rights that we've preserved are going to remain our rights if we fight for them, and particularly when we exercise them. So our struggle for voting rights goes on. This would not be a presentation by Indivisible if we didn't now ask you to do things. We're annoying that way. So as I started, I will end. Make sure that you're registered to vote. and try to do the same for everybody you know. You have now become, in this brief session, seriously more expert on voting rights than most lawyers. I can tell you that because I'm a lawyer and I didn't know half these things before I started putting this together. So, congratulations. In 45 minutes, you have gone to Voting Rights Law School. Now, you need to take what you've learned and make certain that others learn what you've learned. While I don't want to scare anybody, because it does not look like the SAVE Act is going to pass, it is not a bad idea at this moment to think about getting a passport, or if you don't have a passport, making sure you have on hand a certified copy of your birth certificate and any other documentation that shows that you are the person named in that birth certificate. Um, I have not been monitoring the chat, but I'm hoping in the chat we have put a link to our one-page election resource guide, which has a lot of the phone numbers and websites that I've been talking about or alluding to.
Christine put that in.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you, Katrina. Um, Also, if it hasn't gone into the chat, now would be a good time to put a link to sign up for the Indivisible Santa Barbara Elections Committee, where a lot of our indivisible grassroots work will begin. And we'll also be looking to engage you directly through the Santa Barbara Election Protection and Integrity Coalition. So you're going to have a lot of chances to work on these issues. If you like the session, or even if you didn't like the session, you'll give me another chance because we're doing more. At the end of August, August 31st, we are going to do our second Beyond the Basics class on fighting election disinformation. Um, that's going to be a really fun and interesting class. Like for this event, registration will be required. Um, and hopefully we've got a link to that registration that has gone into the chat also. Ah, thank you so much for listening, for going through all of this. I now get to stop sharing and see what time it is, so I have an idea how long I went, which is always fun. Um, oh, okay. I only went about 5 minutes over, um, which is pretty good because I never speak as quickly on Zoom as I do when I'm rehearsing. Now is the time for questions. And Kit, have we gotten any questions in the chat?
Why, yes, we did. So Butterfly asked, how much does a recount cost? And if you don't know it off the top of your head, I actually found stuff off of the official California site. But Larry, do you want to take that first?
Um, well, the joke would be if you have to ask, you can't afford it. But that's a bad joke.
All right, well
It's
then
going to
I will
depend
I
on
will
the
post
election.
this.
Um, and I don't know how much a typical recount costs. It's a really good question.
Well,
Was it
here's what
Butterfly who asked the question?
yeah, yeah. So here's what it says.
Oh,
How
wait
much
a
does it
second.
cost
We
to
have
visit?
Melinda Green is waving her hand, and Melinda may know the answer
I
to
will
this
say
question.
this because I'm with fiscal for clerk recorder assessor, and we will do an estimate. So
In
it
advance?
depends. It depends on a lot of factors, but for that particular recount, the fiscal team will do an estimate. So myself and I have another comrade that we will sit down and we will figure out what the current labor is, what our rates are, and we will do an estimate.
And
You
I
want to
swear,
introduce
Melinda, it
yourself,
is
Melinda? I
now.
don't know everybody knows who you are.
I'm Melinda Green. I'm the clerk recorder assessor elect starting in January 5th in 2020 or 2027. And thank you all, by the way, for your endorsement. I appreciate that. But I can answer that question because I am currently the CFO for the department. So
There you go.
it's something we do as a service, and it is expensive. So sometimes what we've seen in the past is they'll start the process of recount, they'll pay each day, and they'll realize that it's very accurate. So they'll stop paying. They'll cease the recount to save money. So
So it's good to know, Melinda, that we can buy a recount on the installment plan. Uh,
yeah, you pay by day. So
pay by the day.
Right.
Okay. Kid, more questions?
Another one from Butterfly came in. How would a person receive their voter info if they're no longer at that address?
That's a very good question. Um, so the question emphasizes the importance of the state and the county having your current address associated with your voter registration. Otherwise, the information is going. I mean, it's going to go to your old address and possibly be, returned to sender address unknown. I'm Again, without knowing the exact procedures, I would then say go to your local county election office, ask for copies of the material. There are various ways to get a mail-in ballot other than having it mailed to you. I know there's a way to do it electronically. I'm pretty sure that the county election office will print one out for you. Um, so, but the shortest answer to the question is since it's August 6th and ballots aren't going out for the next 2 months, make certain that your voter registration information is up to date. If you have moved, submit a new voter registration form to make sure that your current address is there.
And I'll add, I mean, we do want you to re-register to vote every time you change your name or your address. But if you forget and you don't go into the election office sooner, even election day, you can vote provisionally. So you can essentially register on the day of, you vote provisionally, and as long as you haven't voted another ballot, then your vote will count.
And I promise all of you that when we get closer to election day, we are going to be peppering our information streams with information as to how to register, even though the 15-day window is you've entered that 15-day window, how to vote provisionally. And again, it's that surprising business about the federal law requiring provisional ballots, what a significant voter right that is, because it just seems to lead into all sorts of different ways um, to make it easier to vote.
And one more thing I want to stress that provisional ballots take a lot more work and they are not counted up election night. We don't even start counting those. If people want results election night, which everybody pressures us to give out results right away, they need to vote early and the more provisional ballots there are, the longer it's going to take for us to certify results. It's a lot more work, but worth doing. It's better than, not getting that person to vote at all. So
It's a
it's
it's a
part
critical
of the
right.
process, but it's if we can educate the voter to say re-register when they've changed their address, or if they realize, oh, I forgot, I moved, if they could go into the elections office and get their ballot printed out, if they can do all of that up front ahead of time and not wait until the last minute, it makes our work a lot easier and we can get results to you sooner.
Did you hear what Melinda said about voting early, everybody? Good.
Hmm.
I knew that was going to have a big impression. Um, Boy, are you going to get tired of hearing us say vote early. I promise. You're not tired of it yet. You will be. Kit, what more do you got for me?
We got Catherine Radecki asking, do you know if Santa Barbara County Elections is preparing for any large-scale disruption or attempt to seize ballots?
Oh boy. Um, the answer to that question is complicated. Um, the County Board of Supervisors has had dialogue, much of it public, with the current team running our elections. Um, the sheriff's office has been involved in it. Um, I've already mentioned that the new California law that expressly bans peace officers from interfering in the election process. That's a step forward. All of that being said, I don't think that begins to answer your question. So I'm going to answer the question in a different way. Melinda, you can come in and
How,
answer it. You can answer it directly, but I'm going to answer it indirectly. The job of protecting our elections is going to fall to us. We're going to do it in partnership with the county, but the county alone can't, they simply don't have the tools, particularly if the agent interfering with our elections is an agent of the federal government or any law enforcement. It becomes very difficult at this point because the county doesn't really have a place ultimately to go other than to those same law enforcement agencies. We will be organizing election observer teams and poll watching teams. We're going to be documenting any kind of wrongdoing that goes on election day. We are working on preparing some kind of a rapid response capability so that we can respond as observer citizens to trouble as it takes place on the ground. Um, Melinda, if you want to give a more direct answer to the question, but I had to get in my plug.
Yeah, no, I agree. So we have always addressed the risk of this kind of disruption in our training for many, many years. It's part of our PowerPoint presentation to our poll workers, the method in which we escalate. So yes, this is always a potential risk. It's always been a low risk, but we do address it. We do have specific training and plans for it. And as far as how we're going to deal with it when the risk is maybe slightly greater, we know our rights. We communicate out to everyone. We have full transparency on what's happening. We communicate with media. We communicate with the public as to what is happening, and we hold true to what we know as the law.
Very good. So
And
before I get
we
to the next
spend the
question,
time developing the relationships now so that we know our community partners. We share with our community partners what the law is, and so that we have those, we can mobilize quickly if needed.
right. So I'm going to mention that it's 8 minutes past 8 o'clock. So if any of you feel, again, we advertise this as from 7 to 8. We're going to stay as long as you want us. But any of you who've got someplace else that you need to go, you've already been credited for full attendance. Um, so you get all the points, for having been here. And you can leave with your head held high and hopefully having learned two or three things. But we welcome you all to stay and we'll go through the questions until we finish them all.
Yeah, there are
Judy,
no
what
more
else?
questions in the chat, but anybody else who wants to ask a question.
So that would be a time for you. The easiest way to do this is for you to unmute yourself and use the raise hand feature. Um, but if you can't find the place to raise your hand and you just want to unmute and speak out, that'll be fine. We'll make it work.
I just want to say thank you so much to Viviana for being our interpreter tonight. We really appreciate you coming on and expanding our reach into the community.
And we can, I don't, and so Viviana is waving. I don't think that she's on a particular channel. So you can switch to Viviana's channel if you need to. Okay.
Can you
So
send us your wonderful slides? Denise Williams asks, and I think I already said yes, but that's the correct address.
absolutely. Denise,
Yeah.
if you registered for this presentation and you almost had to get in, we will be sending copies of the slides and copies of our resource sheet to everybody who came. Um, um, it's a small price to pay for having all that material thrown at you so quickly. Um, Also, we exist to answer questions that might come up after the presentation. Um, so um, um,
We have
and
another
we're easy to
question.
find.
Kristen Snedden says, what do you do if your ballot is rejected?
What do you do if your
Example,
ballot is rejected?
ballot rejected because signatures do not match.
Yes.
See, Melinda agrees.
Um, well, first to get a little bit in front of that question, when you submit a ballot, particularly if you're doing it by mail or in Dropbox, use the link that we've put into the chat. And Christina, if you can, could you put it in again? Um, to register online to be able to track your ballot. So when you vote, you'll get a text or another form of message. I get text, so I'm not sure what else there is. Saying we've received your ballot, we've counted it, it's in, you're cool. Um, the next question would be, okay, I've tracked my ballot, but I haven't gotten that message. And I'm getting a little bit nervous. Um, I'm afraid something happened. My ballot got lost in the mail, or it got misplaced, or the dog ate it, or whatever. Um, and I'm going to lean a little bit in Melinda's direction here, but I think the thing that you would do if on election day you do not have a confirmation that your ballot has been received, you can go to your polling place and cast a provisional ballot. Would that be the right way to do it, Melinda?
Yes, better safe than sorry. You can vote provisionally and they'll only count one. So once one's counted, it's in the system. Hopefully everybody's signed up for ballot tracks. That's the Secretary of State system that confirms that they've received your ballot. And if there is a problem, say your signature doesn't match, we do give you a chance to cure it. So we send the person a letter explaining that their signature did not match. So they have a certain time period that'll be defined in the letter and how to cure that.
Right. Well, I'm encouraging everybody to be proactive. Um, in theory, in my experience, it's almost always the case that you're going to hear more than once from the elections office that there's a signature mismatch. But I have heard stories where it hasn't happened. So be proactive. It's your responsibility, all of our responsibilities to make sure that not only that we have the right to vote and that we vote, but that our votes are counted. Remember, those are separate constitutional rights. Um, so use the ballot track system. We put a link into the chat how to do that, and that's also on our resource sheet. Um, Particularly this year, it becomes really critical for you to track that ballot all the way to the point where you know it's been received.
Now, we also have a comment from Denise Williams who says they will only let you vote in person if you cancel your mailed in ballot. You want to address that perhaps?
If you're voting in person, it's a recommended practice to bring your mail-in ballot with you. Um, I don't know the exact procedure of what happens if you go and vote in person and you don't bring your ballot. It may be that your vote then becomes a provisional vote.
Provisional.
Uh, I'm sorry?
Yeah, provisional. We'll give the ballot, and then we'll give you a provisional ballot.
Right.
Or
So,
sorry, we'll spoil the ballot and then you can vote. Otherwise, if you don't have it, we'll give you a provisional ballot.
Right.
right. So, isn't it astonishing how significant that provisional ballot requirement was? Um, was it HAVA? I think it was HAVA that requires. I don't think that was Mother Voter. Um, it looked when I first looked at it like such a meh right, but so many other rights depend on that requirement that states on their provisional ballots. So that's one of the key secret voting rights that you have that you learned about today. Um, so it's a good one to remember.
It's a voting superpower.
Oh, I wish I'd said that. I would have sounded so good if I'd said that.
Better than I would have, Larry.
I don't think so, Melinda, but thank you for saying that.
That's all the
Anybody else have
questions in the
anything
chat.
else
Yeah.
they want, anything that they want to say? Because if we're done with questions and you've just got, you know, polite comments, if we don't have any polite comments, we can go then to the rude comments. But we start with the nice ones. Um, or
Kick-ass, a
it
kick-ass
is 8:15,
presentation,
we can
Larry.
wrap up. Sorry.
Kick-ass presentation, Larry.
Oh, you know just the right things to say.
I'm
Thank
fired
you.
up and I want to protect voter rights now.
Good, good. And for those of you who don't know Kit, Kit is the toughest judge of online seminars of anybody I've ever met. Kit has never met a seminar she wasn't willing to walk out of in about 10 or 15 minutes. So it's high praise coming from Kit. I appreciate it. Thank you. With that, do we wrap up? I see one heart, which was, I guess, a response to my offer to wrap up, which
No,
I'm
that was for Kit. That was for Kit. Sorry, a little
okay.
delayed.
Denise.
Okay, Denise, because it sounded to me like I said, let's wrap up, and you said, thank God.
I just want to say that we're so pleased to be in collaboration with Melinda Green because that really gives us grounding for everything we do. And it's so important to us.
I also want to give a special shout out to two real special friends here. Christina Pizarro from Santa Barbara Women's Political Committee, who has been my primary Zoom assistant, so I did not have to worry about anything other than trying to get done what I needed to get done. And Daniel Gonzalez, who I'm hoping is still with us from Unidas 805, who has been our primary partner and our main liaison with the We Are California group, which is our primary statewide coalition partner in the work that we're doing. Um, we are building an amazing coalition. Just about every organization that you could think of that might be interested in voting is part of our Santa Barbara EPIC coalition. We are building something that we're hoping is going to be very impressive and something that you'll all be proud of. And with that, I'm going to say thank you again. Um, Make sure you vote. Make sure you check to register to vote. Stay in tune. Stay tuned to us. We have more coming. Um, we are going. We are the people who are going to protect this democracy. Um, we're going to follow. We are going to follow the giants who preceded us, who won us these rights. Um, and if it's somewhat disheartening that we are fighting some of the same on some of the same terrain that they did, it is unfortunately par for the course. If voting wasn't really, really important, they would not be fighting so hard to restrict our rights. Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks for including me.
Melinda, it's been a
Always.
pleasure. How long to stop recording?
Melinda, thank you so much for being